Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to the Erickson Report. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next little while, I'm going to be talking about some things that I hope you'll find interesting and worthwhile knowing. So if you have any comments, questions, reactions about the show, you can email them to me directly. This is my personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. And again, if you have any reactions or about the show, feel free. Gushing effusive praise is the most fun, not necessarily the most useful. All right, we're going to start out with one of our features. We call it Heroes and Villains. Our hero here is CNN. Now, back in March, AP, Associated Press, released the newest version of its style book, which is a source used by a number of media outlets. One significant change they made was to say that if something is racist, call it racist. Don't call it racially charged or racially infused or racially tinged or whatever. If it's racist, call it racist. CNN apparently took this to heart, because in the first mainstream media example that I saw myself, an article about Twitty Pie's attack on Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, a.k.a. The Squad, began with the phrase, "in a series of racist tweets." Now, usually, media would only say the word if it was in a direct quote from someone else, and even then, they often prefer to say something like, so-and-so objected to Trump's racially tinged language, rather than call it what it actually was. So it may not seem like much for this, but for any of the mainstream mass media to skip the euphemisms amounts to a breakthrough too long in coming. So for being the first example I saw, CNN is our hero. Our villain, on the other hand, is CNN. In the same article, CNN noted a false accusation against Ilhan Omar that she had praised Al-Qaeda when in fact she was describing the body language used by an instructor at college. She was discussing the idea why terms like Al-Qaeda are not translated into English. Al-Qaeda means the base or the foundation. And said that, maybe that's done, it's not translated because being in a foreign language gives it a bigger meaning somehow. It makes the term seem more ominous. She said, for example, you don't say America with an intensity. You don't say England with an intensity. You don't say the Army with an intensity. But you say these names this way because you want them to carry weight. CNN then said, and I'm quoting the article, "It is possible to argue that Omar was making light of Al-Qaeda's crimes in suggesting that its name itself is what makes people recoil, or that she was implying that there is an equivalence between Al-Qaeda and the U.S. Army." No, it's not possible. Not in the real world. Leaving aside the fact that I'm not at all sure that you can't make an equivalence between Al-Qaeda and the U.S. Army, there's no way a rational person can argue that she was making light of terrorist crimes. CNN here made a stab at defending Omar against the racist attacks, but it remains lost in the very swamp of the phony balance of the very sort that made it impossible for so long to call racism by its actual name. As a result of which, they couldn't do this defense without winding up giving the bigots and the liars a script for another line of attack to use against her. And that makes the network a villain. All right, next we have here the first appearance of what will be an occasional feature at least. This one is called 5 Items Noted in Passing. 5 things worth noting, each of which will be addressed in no more than about a minute or less. There are just, in the course of 2 weeks, there could be so many things that I know that I will never get to. Figured this way I can at least mention some of them. So first, number 1, scientists in Iceland are installing a plaque to memorialize the nation's first glacier lost to climate change. It will be installed next month at the site of the now extinct Ökjökull Glacier in Borgarfjörður, and will include a letter to the future reminding people to do a better job at taking on global warming. Number 2, Senators Ted Cruz and Bill Cassidy have introduced a resolution to brand the loose coalition of anti-fascist groups collectively known as Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. However, the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism found that domestic extremists killed at least 50 people in 2018, making it the 4th deadliest year for such murders in the last 50 years. And every single one of those, they said, had a link to right-wing extremism. Also, according to the ADL, over the past 10 years, the far right has killed hundreds of people and accounted for about 3/4 of the extremist murders in the United States. Number connected to Antifa? 0. Number 3, speaking to Chris Wallace on Faux News, presidential advisor and repeat winner of the Who Wants to Be a Zombie contest, Stephen Miller, said, "I think the term racist has become a label deployed by left Democrats in this country to try to silence and punish and suppress people they disagree with speech they don't want to hear." Which is actually quite true, because "go back where you came from and send her back" is speech that no decent person should want to hear. Number 4. On July 20th, hundreds of activists rallied in Lawton, Oklahoma to demand Tweety Pie stop imprisoning asylum-seeking children. Lawton is the site of Fort Sill, where the government intends to stick up to 1,400 migrant children starting next month. Fort Sill was also the place where members of the Apache Nation were imprisoned in the 1890s as their children were taken away and subjected to forced assimilation at the fort's boarding school. More recently, it was where 700 Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II. And number 5, finally, just a thought. There have been increasing attacks on Medicare for all here being defined as universal health coverage that is not simply a minor extension of the ACA combined with increased subsidies for the private insurance industry disguised as premium support. A primary basis for these attacks has been the claim that most people are happy with their current coverage. But here's the thing, are those people really happy with their insurance? Are they happy with the premiums, the copays, the deductibles, the medically necessary treatments that are put on hold until you can find out if your insurance will cover it? The not being able to choose your doctor because they are out of network? Or are they just happy that they have insurance? Put another way, are these polls really about public sentiment, or are they instead trial balloons to try to determine which lies would be the most effective in scaring people away from actual universal coverage? Okay, next up we turn to our regular feature, and I know a crowd favorite, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. Lincoln, Nebraska has about 50 sculptures installed in places around the city as part of a public art project called Serving Hands Lincoln. To give you an example of what the project is like, these are 3 examples of the types of sculpture that are found around the city. One sculpture, however, so offended one Lincoln woman that she wrote to the mayor to demand it be removed. She described it as 2 hands formed into devil horns. She claimed it to be anti-Christian, demonic, ugly, perverse, and a hate crime against the church, made worse, as if that were possible, by its proximity to the Lincoln Children's Zoo. Now, what could be so bad that it could get that a response? It was this. Yep, the hands were those of Spider-Man. Now, I never thought of myself as particularly tuned in to popular culture, but this is a degree of dissociation that I could never dream of achieving. Footnote, City Ombudsman Liz Quenzer told the woman, "No, we are not going to remove the sculpture." Next up, Representative Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania said on July 16th that he was not offended by Tweety Pie telling Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib to go back to the crime-infested places from which they came. "He does not offend me," he said. Kelly, pictured here, insisted that he had standing to talk about offense because, quoting him, "I'm a person of color. I'm white." Now, you can't really blame Kelly, though. He was just trying to reassert his clown bona fides that he established so well last year. In May 2018, he told Foe and Friends that Democrats spend too much time talking about racial equality. I said, that's not America. We don't talk about those things. Adding that the best way to make America great is to stop talking about discrimination. Meanwhile, Tweety Pie has managed to pull together the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA. It's intended as a replacement for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and includes a few minor improvements in the area of labor and environmental standards, or it does on paper anyway, because it doesn't include any enforcement mechanism for those standards, which means those improvements are really nothing more than corporate promises, and we all know how well those can be trusted. Bluntly, the real purpose of this supposedly but not actually new agreement, which Mexico and Canada agreed to grudgingly, is for Tweety Pie to take credit for it and get a press release out of it. However, that's not the reason I bring this up now. This is why. It's that on July 10th, dozens of House Republicans flooded Twitter with a series of tweets demanding an immediate vote on the proposed trade deal, a vote right now, today, accusing House Democrats in general, and Nancy Pelosi in particular, of harming America by dragging their feet on approval. One problem. The White House has not submitted the agreement to Congress. In fact, it won't do it before September 1st. In other words, these dozens of 15-watt bulbs, and I mean the incandescent version, not the power-saving variety, these dozens of 15-watt bulbs are demanding an immediate vote of approval on a piece of legislation that literally does not yet exist. John Stuart Mill said it for all time. In a parliamentary debate with Conservative MP John Packington, May 31st, 1866, he said, I did not mean that conservatives are generally stupid. I meant that stupid people are generally conservatives. I believe that to be so obvious and undeniable a fact, I hardly think any honorable gentleman would object. This next one. This is actually kind of old, but it just recently came to light as the result of a public documents request, so I feel okay including it here. William Laxen is the principal of Spanish River Community High School in Boca Raton, Florida. In April 2018, he was asked by the mother of a student in an email how his school teaches about the Holocaust, which it's required to do by state law. Laxen replied by saying the school offers a one-day lesson for 10th graders, but said it's not mandatory, as some parents don't want their children to participate. The mother replied that the Holocaust is a factual historical event. It's not a matter of a right or a belief. Laxen, however, persisted. Not everyone believes the Holocaust happened, and you have your thoughts, but we are a public school, and not all of our parents have the same beliefs as you, and so will react differently. And here's the real money quote. I can't say that the Holocaust is a factual historical event because I am not in a position to do so as a school district employee. I wonder what the school teaches about the shape of the earth and the moon landing. Laxen added that the school presents information about the Holocaust to the students that allows them to make their own decisions. And he also says the school does the same when it comes to slavery. Speaking of which, we have the case of Alan and Patricia McCoy, who rented a house in Adairsville, Georgia, a town of 3,000 plus, about 60 miles north of Atlanta. According to a recently filed lawsuit, the McCoys kicked out their white tenant, one Victoria Sutton, because she invited a black coworker and his 5-year-old son over to her home. Maybe you like black dogs, but we don't, so get your stuff and get out, Sutton was told in a conversation that she recorded. She was subjected to multiple uses of the N-word by both McCoys, as well as a physical threat. The McCoys, of course, deny all this, and we know they must be innocent because, as Alan McCoy told a local TV station, some of the best friends I got is colored. All right, and a quick one just to wrap things up. On his radio show on July 22nd, right-wing flake Sebastian Gorka, a man whose name sounds like it's a monster in a Japanese sci-fi flick, you know, Mothra, Rodan, Ghidorah, Gorka, or actually even better, it's drawn from a remake of the Clash of Titans, you know, release the Gorka. Anyway, Sebastian Gorka declared that, I think that whole trans thing started with the Teletubbies. Remember them? One of them wore a tutu. So there's no need to add anything to that. We'll take up our outrages after a break. And we are back. And it's time to go to Clowns and Outrages and now take up our outrages. And we're going to start with an outrage that you probably didn't even know was one. So-called chronic nuisance laws. Towns and cities across the country are passing local laws that punish landlords and tenants when crimes occur on a property. Approximately 2,000 municipalities in the United States have such chronic nuisance ordinances on the books. The ordinances are usually extremely vague, sometimes defining nuisance behavior as whatever city officials decide is an annoyance or an inconvenience. A majority of these laws rely on excessive calls to 911 to make a determination of a nuisance, all of which judgments leave doors wide open to discriminatory enforcement. That's because, upon citation for being a nuisance, property owners typically are instructed to abate the nuisance or face steep penalties, which in various parts of the country can include things like fines of up to thousands of dollars, revocation of their rental permits, even seizure of the property. Many landlords then respond by evicting the tenant, or by refusing to renew their lease, or by demanding that they never call 911, because these laws make no distinction between a tenant that is a nuisance and a tenant that is a victim. So getting rid of the tenant is often the easiest way for the landlord to deal with this. The result is that the people most hurt by these ordinances are poor, handicapped, elderly, and/or people of color. That is, people with fewer resources to fight back and fewer options to pursue, and most particularly survivors of domestic violence, forced to choose between enduring violence and threats or being homeless. One woman, you want some examples here? I'll give you some. One woman was evicted from her home after the city of Bedford, Ohio, labeled her a nuisance and filed her landlord $250. Her crime? She called 911 on 2 occasions because her boyfriend was threatening to commit suicide. A tenant in Neenah, Wisconsin was evicted after police responded to 2 calls in 4 months. The police were called during the first incident because the tenant's boyfriend was ODing on heroin. A man living with AIDS in Portland, Oregon was too sick to clean his yard. A city inspector decided the yard was a nuisance. Portland issued a warrant against him while he was hospitalized for meningitis and charged him $2,000 for the cleanup of his yard, money which he did not have, and he wound up having to sell his house to clear that debt. Too many people facing emergencies. A loved one is having an opioid crisis or a mental health crisis, or they themselves are victims of domestic abuse or some other crime. Too many people facing emergencies feel that they can't call 911 because the end result would be them losing their home. Now, in 2016, the Obama administration called on local governments to repeal chronic nuisance ordinances and said it had issued guidance on how enforcement of such ordinances could discriminate against people with disabilities and thus violate the Fair Housing Act. But they never followed through. The guidance was never issued. And now, of course, there's no way in hell such guidance would be issued before at least 18 months from now. And in fact, Tweety Pie's DOJ has said it won't even force municipalities to follow existing federal guidelines. Proponents of these laws argue that they are necessary to deter crime and protect public safety. But how in hell do you do that by discouraging people from calling for help? That's way beyond my comprehension. Activists have fought back with lawsuits and pressuring local lawmakers with some success, but fighting something like this town by town is a discouragingly long undertaking. All right, happily, in May, New York became the 10th state to pass a law saying you can't be evicted for calling 911. And that's good news, but it's still a long way from putting an end to this outrage. All right, next, this is largely taken from alternet.org's piece on this, so I want to give them most of the credit here. Okay, you send your kid to school. Your kid gets lunch at school. Maybe you don't have the resources or the time to prepare a lunch to carry, or maybe they prefer school food, which, if true, means that school food's a lot better than it was when I was going to school, but never mind that. Anyway, your child gets lunch at school and accrues a school lunch debt. Now, maybe that's because you're financially struggling and have to prioritize other bills like medicine or rent or food for dinner. Maybe you gave your child money for lunch and they forgot to hand it in, or they lost it or someone stole it and they're too embarrassed and ashamed to tell you. For whatever reason, the debt increases. So what does the school do? If your child attends the Wyoming Valley West School District in Kingston, Pennsylvania, they send you a threatening letter saying if the debt isn't paid, you could lose your child. About 1,000 parents received a letter with just this thinly veiled threat. The letter tells parents that, quoting, your child has been sent to school every day without money and without a breakfast and or lunch, though how they know about breakfast, I have no idea, and alleges that failing to provide your child with food could result in parents being sent to dependency court. If you're taken to dependency court, the letter says, the result may be that your child is removed from your home and placed in foster care. Now, making this obscene threat, and remember, we're talking about school lunch here. Making this obscene threat even worse is that the school's cafeteria purchase charging and insufficient funds policy, one of those obviously written by a government panel, but the policy doesn't mention anything about going to court. Joseph Muth, the director of the federal programs for the school district and the author of the letter, made it up. Happily, no one outside the school district is backing up this school's threat. In fact, County Manager David Pedry is his name, issued a statement saying, quoting him, foster care is to be utilized only when absolutely needed. When a child has been abused, is in need, or has suffered a tragedy, it is not, in all caps, to be utilized to scare parents into paying school lunch bills. And Joanne Van Son, who runs the County Children and Youth Services there, feels her agency was weaponized to threaten families, and she called the letter totally inappropriate and unnecessary. Now, now it's true, schools want to collect this money, and the fact is that in some cases, and in some of the districts around the country that have these kind of debt programs, the total debt across the whole district, it sometimes runs to tens of thousands of dollars. So yeah, I understand they want to collect the money. And this own school's insufficient funds policy does have a means of dealing with that. They say if the debt gets big enough, which is for them $10, the parents get a weekly automated phone call until it's paid. All right, you know, a little bit of that, which that's a far, far, far cry from shaming kids by giving them PB&J sandwiches instead of the regular lunch, or much worse, threatening families with taking away their children. That is simply unconscionable. Even more unconscionable is the fact that this should be an issue at all. It's unconscionable that a family should ever be in a position of being unable to afford meals, afford food for their children. The threat of hunger, or to use the technical term, food insecurity, the threat of hunger that still weaves through our nation remains a moral and ethical outrage. And cases like this, where people are threatened and shamed, and by the way, I hope Joseph Muth gets fired, where people are threatened and ashamed because of their struggles, it serves to put that outrage in even starker relief. Okay, we're going to put all that stuff aside because this is sort of like the end of the show. And there's just something I wanted to talk about. It's not really political, although it's as non-political pretty much as we get around here. But it's just something I've been thinking about recently. Because last week, I was outside and looking at some, looking up in the dark at some trees and bushes and whatnot. And I saw something. And I looked again, and oh my gosh, it's a lightning bug. I thought, I cannot remember the last time I'd seen a lightning bug. And when I was a kid, they seemed to be everywhere. It was a ritual of spring and summer to go out and, catch lightning bugs and put them in the jar and find them dead the next morning. And no, putting holes in the lid did not help. I mean, I did that. And it just, you just don't see them. You just don't see them anymore. And I have to tell you, it's not your imagination. They are disappearing. Lightning bugs, or fireflies if you prefer, but they called them lightning bugs where I grew up. Lightning bugs are disappearing. There are 2,000 species of lightning bugs that have been in decline for several years, a couple of decades, in fact. They are disappearing. And so, it's not your imagination. In fact, there's a place now in Tennessee I read about. It's a national forest or a national park. I forget which, but now where people go there in the spring specifically because of the lightning bugs. Specifically because they're still there and you can still see them. It's now become a tourist attraction to be able to see lightning bugs. I still remember one time I was living in town. We were living in a corner, and across the street from us there was an empty yard, and on the other side, off to the left, there was a marsh, a little wetlands, a little thin little stream running through it, just tall grass and reeds, and it was tick hell in spring. But I remember one evening being out there and looking and seeing over this marsh grass hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fireflies, lightning bugs. And at the time, I made my living as a still photographer. That's what I did. I was a professional photographer. And I thought to myself, I could not take a picture that would do justice to this. The lights flickered and swirled and danced and streaked. There's no way to still photograph. And I've seen attempts, but there's no way that you can reproduce that experience. You're not imagining it. They are disappearing. And nobody actually knows why. Nobody actually knows why. But the two biggest, most common notions are loss of habitat. The more we build, the more we pave, the more we drain, the less places they have to live. And the other thing is light pollution. The more we light up the night, the more there are lights, the more they... See, fireflies, those flashes, you probably know this, those flashes are used to find and attract mates. They're part of reproduction. The more lights there are, the harder it is for the lightning bugs to see the other lightning bugs, to see the flashes. And they're also confusing. We humans, we keep forgetting, we keep imagining, how can we affect things? We are so small and the world is so big. But the fact is, not by doing anything special, not by consciously doing it, not by trying to manipulate the natural world, just by living our lives, we humans, especially we advanced industrialized humans, are changing the natural world around us. And even if it turns out that fireflies, lightning bugs, there's no connection, they could disappear without any significant impact on any other species. Even if that was true, it still is a loss that we have brought on ourselves. All right, that's it. I give up. I'm done. That's it for this show. We will see you in a while. We will see you in a couple of weeks. I hope you have the best couple of weeks that you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.